Good morning, everyone. I'm not going to take much time to introduce Brian, can we call you Brian? Because I think the book says a lot about him. I will tell you that on a personal note, he is a wonderful friend and a great neighbor, and I'm very thankful that you came, and I really do appreciate it, and I think I owe you yet another dinner. And okay. May I also mention he is a decorated New York detective, so I guess you should perhaps behave. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to, okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Brian. I know that you have a lot of questions. So he's a stand-up nice guy, and he'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay in the back? All right, first off, I would like to thank Yeshiva Flatbush for inviting me here again. It's quite an honor to actually interact with really what is America's greatest asset. And I look forward, based on my previous appearance here, I look forward to learning as much from you as you do from me. Level of questioning last time I was here was just really top-notch, and it gave me a lot to think about when I left, so I'm looking forward to that.
Who would like to start? We have your picture. Go ahead. Stand up. I'll your picture.
I've been asked that a lot. No, I wouldn't, even though I think my book would be very different from my sister's in that two people can view the same incident and walk away with a very different take. So while everything in my sister's book is truthful and happened, it's like watching a train wreck and one person focuses on the casualties and someone else says, oh, look, a puppy survived. But I don't feel that I don't feel that my personal message is really all that important. I'm happy that my sister wrote the book. I think it's served a great purpose, and I don't think there would be any purpose in my writing a book at this point.
I'm going to repeat the question afterwards.
I'm not sure if you have kids now, but if you do have kids in the future, how would you raise them based on what?
Well, it is a...
The question was, I'm sorry to say, it was addressed in the end of the book that you had a daughter.
It wasn't in the Spark Notes. No. Okay, the question that was asked was, knowing that you have children, which Louis knew, he was just testing him. He just wants to know how it would impact how you would raise your children.
That is a great question, and your test was successful. I was like, wait a minute, do I have kids? And it's really been a struggle for me because in many ways, you know, I don't know if you've read the Crucible, but you know, there is sort of this whole debate of, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger versus, well, sometimes it doesn't kill you, it just cripples you for the rest of your life. And for myself, sometimes with my daughter, I have to really be very conscious of not overcompensating. Oh, sorry. Oh, that's no, it's okay. That's, there's nothing to clip it to, that's the problem. So I have to really overcompensate, and I would imagine actually, I think one of the reasons that the book has been successful is because it addresses issues that a lot of people face. And I would imagine in this room, and many of you have probably heard this from your parents, well, you don't know what it's like, you don't know what I went through, you don't know the sacrifices I went through, kids today have it easy. So there is sort of that fine line, you know, how do you deal with that? So it's something I do deal with on a regular basis. So, and again, that's one of those questions I'm going to be thinking about a long time in the future. So thank you for that. That's a great question. So the question is, what memory is most vivid in my mind? Wow, I really couldn't. I think growing up, sort of dwelling on certain things felt like a luxury. So a lot of memories, I won't say that there are blank spots, but even reading my sister's book, I think I try to ignore a lot of things. That's one of the way I personally deal with things, is sort of what I can't control, just sort of pretend it doesn't happen. So reading my sister's book was interesting because it brought back a lot of memories that I hadn't really thought about in many, many years. So I don't know if I could really pick out any one particular memory and say this was an important moment. But again, I think it's interesting how different people deal with different situations. I think my sister was much more aware of what was happening and taking notes, where I was sort of saying, let me just get through today and I'll worry about other things as they come up. Yes, sir.
Did she confront you before writing the book to ask you for your permission? And if she did or did not, were you angry about her releasing about your own childhood growing up in the thing?
Okay, so the question is, did my sister confront me, and was I angry? Was there any resentment? That's an interesting choice of words. I don't think it applies to me because my sister did reach out to me and say, you know, I'm writing this book. And originally she started writing it just as a cathartic experience, just to sort of deal with some of the issues that she had. When my sister came to me and said, how do you feel about this? My response was, it's your story. And if you have to tell it, then by all means, tell it. So I'm very supportive of the fact that my sister wrote the book. Again, even though in many ways it's not necessarily my story, but I think it's important to, if you feel that you have to say something, I think it's very important to say it. Now, one of my sisters, my sister Lori, I think confront would be the right word. I think Lori was sort of upset by the book, and I think my mother, for obvious reasons, had her issues with the book. But I didn't have any, did not have, and continue not to have any issues with my sister's book. Yes, sir. Okay, so with moving around as much as we did I receive the same academic learning or sort of academic foundation? To answer your question, absolutely not. I taught high school English for a little while, and in some ways that just, I mean, that's a travesty, because, you know, when you start talking about parsing sentences, and I'm like, I don't know that. So I shouldn't admit this in front of the English department. They're going to run me out of here on a rail. But again, there's many, many different ways to learn. I'm sure that the faculty here, you know, constantly tries to point that out. So in some ways, I do have huge gaps in my institutional knowledge. But both of my parents were very, very, they were role models in that they were very curious, and we'd be driving around and they would point things out. They would ask questions. They would engage me in a discussion. And I think more than anything else, if I asked you to take one thing away from the book, that would be that you do show respect to your children. And listen to what they have to say and give them a voice in your discussions with them. And don't fall back on those habits that we all fall back on as parents, where you sort of say, well, I'm the father and that's the way it is, or, you know, I'm the mother, that's the way it is, or I'm the head of the English department, like it or lump it. Not that that would ever happen. But, and my parents, they never they always listened to what we had to say. So as a result, we wanted to have something intelligent to say. So it was sort of like a cause and effect type of thing. So in many ways, my institutional knowledge was lacking, but it was more than made up by the experiences that we were having. And I would encourage you, when you have children, to just keep that in mind. Really listen to what they have to say. Yes, ma'am. How did the siblings view our parents in different ways? I think that my sister is an idealist in many ways, and I'm much more pragmatic. And my sister and I were discussing our father one day, and I said, how do you know, our father was terribly flawed. For all of his positive traits, he was terribly flawed. And I said, how can you ignore that? And my sister made a very telling comment. She said, he's the only person that believed in me when I was a child. So if I totally diminished him, I would have lost much more. I would have gained nothing, and I would have lost a tremendous amount. So that was very telling for me, to sort of step back a little bit and understand that sometimes people have to view a situation in a certain way. I think that's the main difference in how my sister and I view our parents. Yes, ma'am.
What's the most valuable life lesson your parents taught you, and how did they go there?
What is the most valuable life lesson that my parents taught me? Well, and it goes back to, I'm sorry, I forget the gentleman that asked the question, but sort of what was my most memorable experience. One time my mother and I were having a religious discussion, and I think I was 12 years old, and I was arguing with my mother using all the wonderful intellectual arguments that a 12-year-old has. You know, things like, well, if God is all powerful, can he make a rock so big even he can't lift it? That type of thing. And my father pulled me aside and he said, why would you argue with someone about their faith? He said, if you win, you've destroyed their faith. And that's a terrible, terrible thing to do. And I think that is very, very important to keep in mind. Not just about faith, but when interacting with other people, to respect their position, to respect their beliefs, even if they're different from yours, and sort of figure out how you can meld them with yours versus taking a very adversarial or confrontational stance. Yes, ma'am.
How much did your sister embellish the book based on what you remember?
So the question is, how much did my sister embellish the book based upon what I remember? I can pretty much say not at all. If there are any changes in the book, it was literary license where sort of to keep a narrative going, she might change the location. So there were times when I would say, no, this happened in Blythe. And she would say, yeah, I know it did, but then it becomes too disjointed and the book doesn't flow. So there may be embellishments like that. But actually, embellishments, I think, is the wrong word. There may be changes to make it a more readable book, but as far as the incidents, the occurrences, there's not a single incident in the book that I can point at and say, I don't remember this happening, or I don't believe that this happened. If anything, I think she downplayed it a little bit. Again, she sees the train wreck, she sees the puppy escaping. Yes, sir. What is the hardest thing I went through? Standing in front of 150 children at Yeshiva of Flatbush and answering questions. The hardest thing, see, now I'm going to give one of those really cheesy Hallmark answers. But I don't think I could pick any one particular thing out from my childhood. But life itself can be difficult. And it's again, I think that's something I struggle with every day. I think a lot of people struggle with every day, seeing the beauty in the carnage. You know, when you look at what's happening, not only in the world, but more importantly, a lot of times in your own personal life, it's very easy to get caught up in the negativity. And I was looking at the art project in the lobby, and again, I think there's really something to be gained there, where they're sort of saying, you know what, step back and look for the beauty around you. I'm not sure why one of the words in the art project is mango. Perhaps you could explain that to me later. But so I think you're going to find as you go along that you're going to have that choice to sort of say, okay, this is terrible, or to say, well, you know what, there is a silver lining. And again, if you look at history and you look at some of the people that have survived that could have been crushed, right? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the book Night, right? I mean, here's an individual, if you hear him speak, still able to see the beauty in life. You know, how does he do that? How did he do that, given everything that he went through? So you're going to find that a lot of the issues, a lot of the doubts and struggles that you have now are going to stick with you throughout your life. Do you let them rule you, or do you just let them be part of life? So I know it's kind of a cheesy answer, but it's really something I believe strongly in, so sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Being a parent now, can you see like the reasons why your parents have to do it?
I'm sorry, say that last part again. Being a parent now, do I see more reasons in why my parents acted the way they did? My parents, they're really, I can't justify the way my parents acted. They were both very narcissistic. Again, for all their great qualities, you can't really, you can't justify what they did. But again, you know, do I dwell on that? And do I let that crush my spirit? Or do I look at all the times that, you know, my mother would say, you know what, pull the car over, let's look at this sunset. Or, you know, we just saw an interesting tree growing out in the middle of the desert. Let's get out of the car and let's go look at it. So even flawed individuals, I think, have a lot to tell you if you can be open to hearing it. And for a long time, I wasn't open to hearing it. I really could not see much value in my parents. And it's only through the lens of time that I'm starting to gain more appreciation for what they gave me. Yes, sir.
When you and your siblings moved to New York, was it hard for you to see your parents struggle like that?
So, again, great questions, by the way. But so the question is, when we moved to New York, was it hard to see my parents? And the answer, I think we were all sort of annoyed when we heard that our parents were coming to New York, because it was like the whole reason we came here, the biggest attraction in New York was the fact that you were not here. So you coming here sort of defeats the purpose. If I may, I'll tell you a quick story. I got a phone call one day from my mother. She was living out of a van at this time. My father was in a rehab facility, a detox facility upstate. And my mother was living in a van, and she called me up and said, basically, you know, my van has a flat tire. I say basically because of sort of, I think she said my house has a flat tire. But so I went down to the West Side Highway, and she had this beat up old Chevy van, and I went to jack it up. It was the back tire, and I jacked it up, and it was a very old, decrepit van. So as I'm changing the tire, the bumper detached from the van, and the van fell on my leg. So my mother screamed and ran away. So I'm there with my leg stuck under a van, and my mother's sort of running off in the distance. So I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Well, fortunately, it turns out that the rear quarter panel of the van was so rusted that I was able to pull my leg free with relatively ease, no problems. And I went back to where I was living at the time. It was in Midtown Manhattan, and my sister Lori lived across the hall. And as I'm going into my apartment, I hear voices in the other apartment, and I said, that sounds a lot like Mom's voice. So I knock on the door, and I said, is Mom here? And she said, yeah, she's in watching TV. So I said, okay. I said, Mom, what happened? She said, well, I went to get help. Okay, what happened? Well, I couldn't find any. So that is my mother. So yes, it was difficult for me to be around my parents when things like that happened. I took on a lot of responsibility at a young age, and to see my parents sort of abdicate responsibility, it was difficult for me. To have them in close proximity like that was difficult for me. But again, you know, with the lens of time, they were who they were. And I can either pick the good out of that or let the bad destroy me. So, but no, I was not happy when they moved here. Yes, sir.
So in the book, it seems like your mother was very happy one day painting and then not depressed the next day. Do you think she may have suffered from mental?
So the question is, my mother with her mood swings, very happy one day, very depressed the next day. Were there some type of mental health issues? I think so. I'm not sure how much of that is environmental. I certainly think she had a predilection for depression, and I think if you put yourself in certain situations, if you're living in an abandoned building in the Lower East Side, it's hard not to be depressed. So if you have a tendency to go that way anyway, and you put yourself in a situation like my parents put themselves in, I think it will certainly heighten it. But I do think that there was I do think that there is certainly a tendency toward, if not outright mental health issues, certainly a tendency toward them. So there was a gentleman in the back. I didn't want to ignore him. Was it you? No? Okay, sorry. Yes, sir.
Do you still keep in touch with all your siblings?
So do I still keep in touch with all of my siblings? I speak with Jeanette on a regular basis. Lori, I believe, and again, it goes back to narrative. Had to sneak a literary term in there. Ms. Bloom told me if I didn't sneak in a couple of literary terms, I'd be in big trouble. And I'm assuming that groan when she said, cook me dinner, was that you've had her cooking before. That's what that was about, right? I keep in touch with Jeanette on a regular basis. I think Lori has created her own narrative, and I don't think she wants anyone really around to sort of contradict that. So talking to Lori, she'll say certain things, and I'll say, but that's not really what happened. So I think Lori needs to create her own version of what happened, and I think that I inadvertently challenge that on some level. So I don't speak much to Lori. My sister Maureen, who lives out on the West Coast, moved there after she got out of jail for stabbing my mother. She's paranoid, schizophrenic, and delusional, and I think my speaking to her upsets her, so I don't speak to her very often. And as far as my mother, it's interesting. As I let go of some of the negativity I had toward my mother, I had a little bit of an epiphany, and I was like, great, now I can have a relationship with my mom, because I didn't have this anger that really was stunting me as a person. But what I realized is even when the anger was gone and talking to my mother, it was like, well, I could have a relationship with her, but I don't really want to, because we just don't really see the world in the same way. So we talk and we're civil, my mother and myself, but it's not like we spend large amounts of time together. Yes, all the way in the back. Right. So has my childhood impacted in my careers? I think that was the question, right? Yes, I do think it has. Right now, I work for Habitat for Humanity, building low to moderate income housing and teaching construction. I think that my childhood made me very idealistic. Part of the reason I became a police officer was because I really wanted to help people. And that's why it's upsetting to see the current state of community police relations, because I do think that the police can be a very, very benevolent presence in communities. But I think more importantly than anything else, it just dealing with individuals, it's made me understand that not everyone is who they appear to be. And I think it's important to keep that in mind no matter what age you are. Even dealing with some of your classmates, there may be things that are happening that you're not aware of. And one of the benefits of my childhood was it was so obviously dysfunctional that I really was able to deal with it. It made it easier to deal with. As opposed to some of the other issues that I now talk to people and they talk to me about issues they had as children, abuse, just lack of respect, and that it was subtle, so it made it very difficult for them to deal with. So if I'm going to look at a silver lining, the fact that my situation was obviously so outlandish that it made it much easier to deal with. So, yes, ma'am. I heard, does my mother still see the world? Does my mother still see the world in that rose-colored land? Yes, she does. And again, me being a bit of a pragmatist, it creates problems for us because I feel the need to correct her. She's 82. I'm not going to change her at this point. It's something I have to deal with, but it is frustrating. And she'll say things like, oh, we sure had fun. And it's like, Mom, eating out of garbage cans, that wasn't a whole lot of fun. You do what you have to do to survive, but let's not put too positive a spin on it. So, but she does still see the world that way, and it makes me a little nuts sometimes. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, since my father was an alcoholic, what are my feelings toward drinking? At one point, and particularly when I was in the police department, there is a culture of drinking. It's part of the process. It's part of the bonding process. So I think there was a period in my life where I realized I'm drinking more than I should. And I cut back. It got to the point that, if I were in a bar or with friends having a drink, I would make sure that I left some alcohol in the glass. Because one of the memories of my father is that would be the last thing he would do. Anytime he'd leave a place, he would drain his drink. There could be a steak dinner sitting in front of him, and that was fine. He didn't mind wasting that, but you could not leave any alcohol behind. So I think that I, in some ways, overreacted toward drinking, by being as strict as I was, to the point that there were times I would order a drink just to leave it on the bar, just to prove that I could. And I think that you have to be very, very careful with what you go through, that the tail doesn't start to wag the dog. So now, I'll have a drink in a social occasion, but I try not to be as fanatical about leaving it behind as I was. But I'm out of practice, so I don't really drink much, which I'm fine with. Yes, ma'am. So how did I feel when I found out that my mother owned land worth millions of dollars? I don't think there was an epiphany or a watershed moment where it came to light. It was sort of always there. So there never was that sort of, you know, whipping away the curtain and saying, you know, what's this? So it always sort of existed. It was a mixed blessing because there would be periodically, there would be money that would come in from that, and we would all benefit from that. When I was a child, I wished, you know, I wanted her to sell it. But maybe she was right. If she had sold it, you know, her and my father would have frittered it away. And now she basically lives off the money from that. So, again, people are very strange with their priorities, and that's just. But the bottom line is, it's my mother's. It's not mine. So she can do whatever she wants with it. Not what I would have done, you know, in her situation. But again, you have to let people live their own lives sometimes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. How did I feel when my father passed away? I was at work in a meeting and got a phone call that my father had passed away. And I said, okay, thank you. The news had passed along to me by my lieutenant. And I said, let's finish up the meeting. And everyone looked at me, you know, don't you want to go home, don't you? So I was very, very out of touch at the time with regards to how I felt about my father. About 10 years later, my father-in-law died, and I couldn't stop crying. And I think those were the tears that I really couldn't cry for my father. One thing, and again, one thing that's not in the book, when my mother found my father, he was sitting on the front stoop of their building. She said, I was talking to my mother, and she said, I went out to walk the dog, and your father was on the front step of the building, on the stoop, and he had a 40-ounce beer that was about 3/4 full. So after I walked the dog, I called 911, and I said, Mom, you called 911 after you walked the dog? And she said, well, he wasn't going anywhere, which is, there is a certain logic to that. And then she said something that really got me very, very angry, and it was one of the reasons why I had some of the issues I had with my mother. She said, but I was happy to see that he had almost a full beer because he died doing what he loved best. So it's the reason I bring this up is because people are complicated. My mother didn't want to deal with the fact that my father had passed away. So she walked the dog. She had an excuse not to deal with it, hoping that someone would come in the interim and deal with it for her. And I really criticized my mom for that for many, many years. But yet, ironically, I didn't want to deal with the fact that my father had died. So it was easy for me to vilify her, but yet in some ways I did the same thing. So I think sometimes you do have to sort of step back and just look at your own actions. Do I see some traits in myself that I picked up from my parents? Yes, I think so. I think both good and bad. I think many of the things that my father did with me, I do with my daughter. And there's always that. I think any child is going to have an unusual relationship with their parents, even in ideal situations, because this group in particular, young adults in the age range that you're at, you almost have to start growing away from your parents. You have to create some type of a division and some separation because you are going to be going out on your own. So again, how do you do that and still be respectful? How do you do that and not throw out the baby with the bathwater? So I think I got a lot of very good traits from both of my parents. And every once in a while I'll see them and it'll be like, whoa, didn't expect that. But yeah, your parents, I think, influence you much more than you realize. Yes, sir.
When you moved up to New York, was it hard to transition to a new life?
When I moved to New York, was it hard to transition to a new life? Not at all. At least not for me, because I was so used to moving and so used to chaos. I think you could have taken me and dropped me in the middle of anywhere, and I would have blended in. I was sort of very chameleon-like at that point, and very adept at blending in. And New York was a very, very different place then. My first apartment was $152 a month rent in Midtown Manhattan. So in some ways, I don't envy you guys in that it's I think things have become much more complicated. I think it was easier for me to transition than in many ways than what you're facing. I mean, you do have great challenges ahead of you. Luckily, you've got a great solid foundation, and that's something I don't think you should take for granted. I think that if you look at what you're being given today here at Yeshiva Flatbush, I think it's going to serve you in very good stead as you do move forward. But it is going to be, I think you're facing more challenges than I did as a child or as a young adult. Yes, sir.
As a cop, have you ever encountered similar situations as your family? And if so, how do you react to them?
Oh, so as a cop, as a police officer, did I ever encounter similar situations? Yes, absolutely. And my mother and father, despite the fact that they loved each other, oftentimes their arguments would turn physical. So I was very intolerant of that. I continue to be intolerant of that. I don't think that there's, and this is probably chauvinistic, but I'm much more, I have a much larger issue with a man putting his hands on a woman than vice versa. I mean, obviously you don't want to engage in physical violence, but I probably was not as willing to listen to the man's version of events when there was physical abuse involved. One of the problems, though, was where you would see children living in a situation that children really shouldn't be in. How do you deal with that? Because a police officer is more or less a short term, it's the Band-Aid. They're not going to give you the operation that you need. They're not going to give you the long-term care that you need. So as a police officer, you come in, you put on the Band-Aid, and you hope that it works. So that probably is one of the biggest frustrations about being a police officer, is that you don't have that lasting impact. Yes, sir.
If your father ended up building the glass castle, would your siblings would have been better off, or were you better off moving away from your
Wow,
family?
interesting question. If my dad had built the glass castle, would we have been better off? Or would we have been better off moving away from our parents? I think ultimately you have to move away. And if you had built the glass castle, that would have been very bad in some ways. And I think as young adults, you are going to run into maybe family members almost trying to create a situation where it's difficult for you to come on into your own, for you to move away. So luckily we didn't have that temptation. But I think one of the challenges that you're facing, and I'm sure many of you thinking about this already, is how do you move away? And not necessarily strictly in the physical sense, but how do you start to get that separation where you become your own person? As far as a dream realized, I don't know. Maybe you're better off always having the dream than actually accomplishing it. I would advise all of you to read a poem called Ithaca by Kafavi, where he talks about the journey as opposed to the actual destination.
Sorry, I have one last question.
Yes.
Who's paying you in the
Well, that's like 3 questions. She wants to know who's playing me in the movie, and am I going to have to pay to get in? No, because I'm going to sneak in. I was very disappointed that Jackie Chan was not available. I really felt that he was my first choice. It's a relatively unknown actor, Josh Gowan, who is playing myself. I believe Naomi Watts is playing my mother. Brie Larson is playing Jeanette. And Woody Harrelson is playing my father. And I think it's coming out in around Thanksgiving of next year. Now, which grade is this? 12th. Oh, okay. Too bad you won't be here because I would have snagged the DVD and given you an early preview, but sorry. You got to pay the $10. Or you can sneak in with me. Either one.
I think the bell's going to ring in any minute, but I would very much like to thank Brian and Roger for the seniors. The first time in a long time they found a book they really enjoyed reading, and I'd like to thank them.
Thank you. And no exaggeration, great questions, very thoughtful, insightful questions. Thank you.